1 Peter 3:15 says, always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you for the hope that is in you. And that's what I'm going to do today. I want to give you some of the most life-changing moments, close encounters with Jesus that I've had over my lifetime. And I'm going to put that in a very brief framework of the rest of my life. And so I was born in Holland. You can see a little picture there. Born in Holland in 1948 into a nominally Christian home. And what I mean by that is we went to church, but I never heard the gospel until I was 19. When I was 13, the Cold War between America and Russia was heating up, and so my parents decided to get out of the firing line and emigrate to Australia. We arrived there in 1961. I went to church here in a Presbyterian church, and I have to confess, I didn't go there to get close to Jesus. I went because I wanted to get to know the girls there. And I bought myself a $20 guitar at a garage sale, taught myself to play. I had a pretty good voice, and I loved Peter, Paul and Mary. And so it was a great way to impress the girls. And that's me in my heyday at age 17, winning a talent contest in Coolangatta. And then, when I turned 19, my sister came back from the USA from a holiday, and she had found Jesus over there. And that's the first time I heard the gospel preached. So I have my sister, big sister, to thank for that. And she had an air about her, an air of confidence, a sense of purpose, a peace, and I really envied that. And so that year, I took my annual holidays for about 4 weeks over Christmas, New Year, and then I had about 3 weeks in January, and I decided to go on a sabbatical, hop in my car by myself, and go and find out just what was important to me and what life was all about. And before I left, my sister gave me an exercise book, and she dutifully written out dozens of scriptures, all to do with salvation. And I took that up there, and I drove as far as Port Stephens, and I'm up there, and I'm trying to do all the things that I love doing, like body surfing, and swimming, and sunbaking, and reading, and I just had this incredible restlessness come over me, and I couldn't do anything more than half an hour, and then I'd be off again, and I'd read a book, and I couldn't remember after half an hour what I'd read, and I read all the scriptures that my sister had given me, and it didn't mean anything. And the second day, I was worse. It was even less time I could spend doing any of those things, and I didn't know what to do with myself. And the third day, I found myself driving down this beach road at Nelson Bay, totally deserted. There wasn't another car around or a person. There was no housing development anywhere. And I'm just driving along very slowly. And then there was a presence in the car. And I burst into tears. And I pulled over by the side of the road. And by then I knew who it was. And I started bawling my eyes out. I said, Lord, I'm so sorry for all the times that I've ignored you. I'm so sorry for all my selfish agendas and all just wanting to do things to please myself. I'm so sorry. And then suddenly I knew this was the time. And I said, Lord, please come into my heart. and take charge. And then I'm bawling my eyes out still, I don't know for how long. And I'm sitting there, and then I started laughing at the same time I was crying. And then I started singing, and how on earth anyone can do all three things at once, I have no idea. But I was somehow doing it. And then I decided to drive straight home and tell my family what had happened. And I got in the car. I picked up a hitchhiker just down the road, and I was in no state to tell him what had happened. And he asked to be let off after 2 minutes. And then I drove home to a roaring reception, of course. And I was so filled with peace. So filled with peace that I spent the next 3 weeks just at home playing games with my little sister until it was time to go back to work. And when I went back to work, just before, I said, Lord, please send me one person every day with whom I can share what has happened to me. And please, Lord, send me to one Christian venue every weekend so I can share in a group situation what has happened. Well, that prayer was answered like you wouldn't believe. I ended up sharing with people at the station, people at work. I was sharing with 2, 3, 4, 5 people every day. And at the weekends, what I would do, I'd get invited. The word must be good, getting around. I got invited to 2, 3, 4, sometimes 4 venues every weekend. And I would tell them what had happened. And what I would do at those venues, I'd play a couple of Peter, Paul and Mary songs to start off. And it's amazing how many Peter, Paul and Mary songs have a spiritual message. And so I would use that to edge into what had happened to me, or what later on what the Lord was doing today or last week. And it was amazing how successful it was. It was a bit like the gospel according to Peter, Paul and Mary, but it wasn't. It was very successful. In the end, after about a year of this, people at work would cut a wide berth around me because they knew that if they came anywhere close to me, they'd get bombarded with what the latest thing is, what Jesus was doing in my life. Within a short time, I was married. I remember standing up at my wedding ceremony, making a speech and saying, if you both have Jesus, how can things possibly go wrong? And I'm afraid that was a rather naive statement, not taking into account the human element. We had 3 children. There they are, Danny, Ben, and Natalie. I wrote a Christian novel. I think that's the next one. And I ended up building my house on 5 acres. There it is. That's over the next 20 years. And we mixed in mostly a charismatic circles because we both believed that they had a lot to offer. But there were a few doctrinal issues that I had a problem with, and that caused a lot of friction between me and my wife. Skip forward to those 20 years, and it's the year 1990, and it's in March. I was sitting on the beach at Newport with 2 fishing buddies. And we'd been sitting there for 4 hours in the dark, and I wasn't able to even get my bait taken off. We're just sitting there. And so I decided to move away from the other 2 onto a concrete stormwater outlet at the southern end of the beach. And I cast my line in as far as I could, and then I plonked down on my fishing bucket, and I decided to use the opportunity to have a good old whinge to the Lord. I said, Lord, this is ridiculous. We had such high expectations when we got married. And now everything's gone to pot. My marriage is on the rocks. My kids are running away from home. I hate my job. I'm totally, utterly exhausted all of the time. And now I can't even get a fish to bite. And you said in your word that you had come that we might have life and have it more abundantly. Now, did you mean in the hereafter or in the here and now? And as I finished saying the word now, my line went screaming off into the ocean. It was the most instantaneous answer to prayer that I've ever had in my whole life. That fish could have been 20 seconds earlier, and I wouldn't have prayed, but I did. And so, as any fisherman will tell you, once you've got a big one on, the rest of the world stops. And I spent the next 20 minutes bringing in the biggest fish that I've ever caught. And if you don't believe it, there's a picture of it. It was a 3-foot mulloway or jewfish. And I left the beach that night, totally convinced that we were to have life more abundantly here and now. So you can imagine my utter confusion when 6 weeks later I was told I was dying with chronic myeloid leukemia. And I remember walking away from St. Vincent's Hospital, the back streets of Darlinghurst there, and I felt like I'd been hit over the head by a 3B2. And then slowly as my head cleared, the first thought that came into my mind was, what a good way out. And the second thought was, I haven't yet committed a major sin. A very religious thought, but that was the beginning of an enormous faith struggle. I rethought everything that I'd been taught in 20 years of being a Christian. Everything, especially the things about healing. And I knew that Jesus has died both for my sin and my sickness. That's what it says. And it's much easier to apply that to somebody else than to yourself. And I didn't know what to do with it. And I struggled. Every Christian I knew had some advice. Some said I had to change my diet. And some said, hey, you've got to have more faith. As I was squinting my eyes and grinding my teeth with some manufacturer. I've even had people say to me, what great sin have you committed for God to put this on you? And I struggled with all of it. And it was a few months. I said, Lord, I can't work this out. I can't believe that this is a sheer accident, that I have a fatal illness. I'm sure you're trying to tell me something, but I don't know what it is. And so I said, Lord, even though I don't know what you're trying to tell me, I'm happy with whatever you decide. And if you want to take me now, that's good. And if you want to keep me around for a bit longer, that's good too. And as I completely surrendered my will to him, a little light came on in the back of my head. And I knew I was going to make it. Now, the doctor at St. Vincent's had told me there were 3 phases to chronic myeloid leukemia. One was a chronic phase that lasted 5 years. One was an accelerated phase that lasted a year. And one was an acute phase, which lasted about 6 months. And I was already somewhere in the accelerated phase. What was good is that it turned out that my big sister came to the rescue again. She turned out to be a completely compatible donor for bone marrow for me. And so, with this little light burning in the back of my head, I walked into hospital with a smile on my face and telling jokes to the doctors and nurses. The doctor said, you realise that after this transplant, you will have female blood running around your veins. And I said, will that make my voice squeaky? And he said, no. And I said, well, I still like girls. And he said, of course. And then I said, will I be able to play the piano? He said, absolutely. And I said, that's fantastic. I can't play now. And then I looked at him very seriously and I said, Doctor, have you had any instances of miraculous healing from chronic myeloid leukemia? And he said, no. And I looked him in the eye and said, you may be in for a surprise. And so I went into hospital. It was both horrendous and wonderful. Horrendous in the sense that I was dry retching for 5 weeks straight. I couldn't take any food by mouth, and I wouldn't be able to keep it in. And I went in at 12 stone, and I came out at 10 and a half. I looked like I just escaped from a concentration camp. But the wonderful thing of it was that entire 5 weeks in hospital, Jesus sat by my bedside, held my hand. Now, I survived leukemia. The amazing thing is I found out after 2 years that I was the only one left alive of a clinical trial that I'd been part of. About 50 people. A lot of those people were given a number, the chances of survival for 5 years. And a lot of them were given a 75% chance, and I had a 15% chance. And then I find out after 2 years, I'm the only one left alive. And I often wonder what my doctor thought after what I told him about the surprise. Yes, I survived leukemia, but the marriage didn't. And so it was the start of a whole new life. I bought a house just down the road from here, less than 1 kilometre away. And there I started studying the Bible in earnest. I really wanted answers. And so I would take a subject, any subject, and I'd start researching it and reading what the Bible had to say about it, and then writing an essay, stating my conclusions. And then with the encouragement of my son, Dan, over there, I published those essays on the internet. And when I had written enough essays, I compiled them all into a book. And there it is, In Defense of the Gospel. I also started a games night, a Christian games night at my place. Second Friday of every month, we had a get-together at my place, and loads of people have crossed my doorstep. And we would share the Lord, share a good time, share some laughs and some music, and then share a meal. And then we would play cards till all hours. And just in 2000, I did that for 20 years, that games night. And in 2011, I was diagnosed with a brain tumour. And it was the size of a large egg on this side of my head, pressing on the language centre, and the only symptoms I had, I stopped being able to read and write properly. And when I was diagnosed, for another day, I looked death in the face. And it didn't bother me terribly much. And I laughed at somebody who was crying because I had it. And somehow it came good. They ripped it all out. I'm still here. I started a rumour that, hey, doesn't matter what they throw at him, they can't get rid of him. And, okay, it was around that time that I met Jane. And she started coming to my games night until I couldn't do it anymore. And then I've been diagnosed with another thing. It doesn't matter what they throw at me. I've now got a condition called IBM, or inclusion body myositis, which is a muscle eating disorder, and it's really sapping my strength. I have trouble standing up and walking around, and I use this silly thing. Thing is that after I was diagnosed with that, I asked Jane to marry me. And she said yes, knowing full well what she was in for. Thank you, darling. Phil married us in November 17, and I've been coming here ever since. So now I want to get into what have I learned from all of this. First of all, I want to say what an incredible privilege and blessing it is to be able to study this word freely in this country. It is the most remarkable document ever put together. It has no parallel anywhere in the world. It was written by numerous different writers, and it was over a period of thousands of years and in several different languages. And yet it's so coherent that it could have been written by a single author. How would I describe this? If you said to me, hey, put in one sentence what do you think this is? I think it is a love story. It's a love story of a creator God expressing his love for his creation. It has a mind-blowing introduction, a great plot, then a fantastic climax, and then an epilogue to beat every epilogue ever, when the eternal purpose is finally brought to fruition. Another way to describe this would be to say, hey, it is God revealing himself to us. He tells us who he is in here. And you may well ask, why does he want to do that? Why would an almighty, all-powerful God, all-knowing God, want to reveal himself to us? And remarkably, the answer is fairly simple. Because he said to us, I am a jealous God. I do not want you to have any other gods in your life. And in order to make sure that we worship him, he has to tell us who he is. And so he tells us exactly who he is. Man is very good at making up their own God. Everywhere throughout history, mankind has made up their own gods and made little statues to worship, and little whether they're made of stone or of wood or of metal, and we make up our own God. But in today's world, we still do some of the same. I've had people say to me, hey, I can't believe in a God who would send his own people to hell. But I'm afraid we're stuck with him the way he is. We can't change God. We have to worship the God that's described in here. I'll give you one example. How easy it would be to change God, to try and change him. I've been divorced. And in Malachi 2:16, God says, I hate divorce. How on earth do I assimilate that in my daily walk with him? It would be very tempting for me to pretend that God has lightened up on his attitude towards divorce, especially in this new culture where nearly half of all marriages end up in divorce. But if I follow that train, I end up worshipping a God who doesn't hate divorce. He's changed, and I'm changing a slightly modified version of him. And if you start doing that, suddenly you're worshipping a false god. And so I can't do that. The only way I can deal with this is to get on my knees and ask God to forgive me for my sin. I confess my sin, and he has forgiven me. One of the most outrageous examples of people making up their own God was the Israelites enslaved in Egypt. God brings them out with miracle after miracle after miracle. And these people, he parts the Red Sea, and he sends manna from heaven, and he brings water out of a dry rock. And they end up at Mount Sinai. And Moses goes up the mountain to talk with God. And it's only a couple of weeks, and these people start saying, hey, he's not coming back. And we better make ourselves another idol to worship. And they make a golden calf. And the repercussions are outrageous. When Moses comes back down the mountain, thousands of the people guilty are slaughtered. And except for Caleb and Joshua, the only two people who were in Egypt when they were set free, only them and the whole lot of people that were born in the desert were allowed into the promised land. God has revealed himself. You want to go back to the first chapter of Genesis. He reveals himself as the creator. He tells us he made us. He tells us how he made us, why he made us. He tells us how long he took to make us. And then he even tells us, roughly, we can calculate how long ago he made us. But he doesn't stop there. Then he tells us why we are in the predicament that we're in, why we need salvation, and from what. And then he continues to reveal himself as a God who is almighty, all-powerful, all-knowing, and omnipresent. He's everywhere. And he's infinitely good, infinitely loving, and also infinitely righteous. So righteous that the Israel nation is unable to live up to his standards. So he provides an out for them. They can get remission of sins through the sacrifice of animals and the shedding of blood. But the whole Old Testament is also sprinkled with prophecies about the coming Messiah who's going to make things right once and for all. And so in some ways, the Old Testament is like an unfinished symphony. We're waiting for the Hallelujah chorus. And when Jesus arrives, he fulfills 200-odd prophecies about his coming. And suddenly, the whole symphony is complete. And there, God doesn't stop in revealing himself. There's one more thing that he wants to let us know, and that is about him being a Trinity. The word Trinity doesn't actually occur in the Bible, but we know God is a Trinity because they talk about each other. And in order to come to terms with the word Trinity and the nature of God being a Trinity, very hard to get your head around. You need a revelation rather than an education in that matter. Muslims actually think that we worship three gods, but we worship one God in three persons. Blessed Trinity. And so, it's the Apostle John is the first one to have that revelation. He starts his gospel message with it. In the beginning, he says, was the Word, and he's talking about Jesus. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him. And apart from him, nothing came into being. And you've probably read it 100 times. I had. I still didn't really know what it was saying. And then the Apostle Paul has the revelation. He says, by him and for him were all things created. In Colossians 1:16. And if you let those verses sit there and simmer, and you wait long enough, and then they get into your spirit, and suddenly you have the revelation yourself. What it means. Jesus was present during creation week. I always thought of the God of the Old Testament being the Father, and the God of the New Testament being Jesus, and the God of the modern day church being the Holy Spirit. But you can't put God into pigeonholes. Jesus was there at the first sunset. Jesus was there when God put Adam together out of the dust of the earth and blew life into his nostrils. Jesus was there when he put Eve together out of one of Adam's ribs. And then you realize that the gospel doesn't start in the New Testament. It starts in Genesis. But there's something else. And this will take your breath away. And this will put goosebumps on your arms and send chills down your spine. Because then Jesus comes and he takes everything I've just told you and he shakes it vigorously, and then he grabs it and he turns it upside down and he makes it personal. And then suddenly I realize that the same God who watched the first sunset, the same Jesus invaded my car some 50 years ago and was knocking on the door of my heart, asking to be let in. And the same Jesus who put together and blew life into Adam is the same Jesus as the one who told me that I was to have life more abundantly. And the same Jesus who put together Eve is the same Jesus who brought Jane into my life, because he could see it was not good for Albert to be alone. And the same Jesus who died on the cross is the same Jesus as who held my hand for 5 weeks in hospital. And the same Jesus who rose again is the same Jesus who made sure that I survived leukemia. This is the same Jesus who thought of me before my parents ever did. This is the same Jesus who covers for me whenever I mess things up. And this is the same Jesus who upholds me every day that I get around. He is the hope in me. He is that hope in me. And not so much that he'll fix me, make my legs and arms work again. I know he could. I wish he would. And I don't understand why he hasn't. But the real hope in me is that when things get tough, he'll hold my hand. And that when my time comes, he'll gently lead me into the promised land. Thank you. Now, if there's anybody here who has never made that decision to invite Jesus into their heart, please come forward and we will pray with you. And if there's anybody here who wants to revive a relationship they made with him years ago and wants a real revival, come forward, please.